Hello everyone and welcome back to Project Next. My name's Finn Blake and I'm bringing to light success stories to empower the next generation. I'm extremely excited for episode 9. I'm going to be talking to the managing partner of McKinsey and Company in Australia and New Zealand, Angus Dawson. In this episode, Angus tells me all about what life is like at the helm of one of the world's top corporate firms. From business analyst to managing partner, Angus shares plenty of learning experiences from throughout his entire journey. Angus also gives a great deal of insight into interviewing with the firm, how to approach complex problem solving, and the trends that will shape the future of management consulting. If you're looking to explore a career in consulting or strategy, then this episode is the one for you. As always, a friendly reminder to hit the subscribe button below if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit that like button. This episode is one of my favourites so far, so without further ado, let's get straight into it. Angus Dawson, the managing partner of McKinsey and Company in Australia and New Zealand. Thank you so much for joining me, Angus. I'm really looking forward to the chat.
Thanks for having me, Finn.
So, Angus, I'd love to go back to the start of your journey when you were sort of growing up and at home with your family. Do you remember having any idea about what you actually wanted to do for your career?
I was someone who was always pretty interested in business. My mum was an entrepreneur. She founded a business renting out bicycles in Centennial Park in Sydney back in the 70s, and I used to work there as a kid, as an 8-year-old, standing on the milk crate operating the cash register and riding the bikes around the block to put them away. And my dad was a business executive. And I loved hearing about kind of what he was up to. I loved going out to the factories and checking it out. So I think I always had a bit of a love for business. Yeah.
For myself, I know that it was a challenging time for me, leaving high school. And I think a lot of students go through a bit of a struggle when they're, leaving school and trying to think of what they want to do beyond their year 12 studies. Do you remember much about what went into your decision to, go to the University of Sydney and do a Bachelor of Laws in Economics?
Look, I spoke to lots of people, and I probably landed on economics and law, I don't know, almost as a default, because it was a great foundation, I thought, for doing something in business and would give me lots of options. I did that, I think, always expecting that I would never be a lawyer. But yeah, it was very much around kind of foundations, and I decided to major in accounting and economics. I think someone had said to me, major in accounting so you're never at the mercy of the accountants, and do law so you're never at the mercy of the lawyers. It was probably later that I kind of reflected that I'd probably missed a bit of a trick on technology and engineering and those sorts of things, which I sort of came back to later.
It's interesting you say that you didn't necessarily want to do law, but you wanted to study it. There is a lot of discussion at the moment about whether, you should go into doing a law degree if you don't necessarily want to practice, because some people, I know the former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, has said that he thinks it's a silly idea to go in and do that if you don't think about practicing beyond your degree. So what is your take on that at the moment? And do you think there is still merit in going back and doing a lawyer's degree?
Yeah, I mean, look, I still probably think what I thought back then, which is law's such a foundation of, modern society, whether it's, understanding kind of the historical foundations of law, the importance of the rule of law, the importance of the legislative process, the constitution, as well as sort of the more kind of drier parts of the law around, regulation of business and securities market law and corporations law and tax law and things like that. I've actually found it's been a really useful thing to understand and a really useful foundation. So, no, I don't regret it at all, actually. And I loved studying it, actually. I don't think I would have loved practicing it because I think it would have been a bit repetitive. But I loved studying it. I thought it was fascinating.
And then, Angus, you joined McKinsey in 1996. Tell me about the decision-making process that led you to embark on a career in consulting.
Yeah, so for any of your listeners who are sort of currently into economics and law, you get the whole kind of recruiting season comes around, and there are those who are sort of all snapped up by internships and things like that. I actually never set foot inside a law firm to do an internship or an interview or an information thing or anything. So I kind of knew that I wanted to do consulting. I knew a few friends who'd sort of gone into consulting. I thought, again, it would be a great foundation for a career in business. Here I am 25 years later, still building my foundation. And I'd skipped all the law internships and stuff. I did an internship actually at a firm called Arthur Andersen, which doesn't exist anymore. It sort of went down with Enron. And I loved kind of the work there, looking at businesses. I did a valuation of a shopping centre, and as it turned out, their focus was much more tax and audit. So I had the dubious distinction of being the only one of the 23 interns who didn't end up with a graduate offer because I didn't want to do tax or audit. So I only interviewed for consulting firms. I knew it was what I wanted to do, and I was willing to sort of go through that process, and then kind of, if it didn't work, then take stock again afterwards. As it turned out, it did work, and I joined.
Awesome. And so, Angus, I know a lot of people have a pretty blurry understanding of the role that consultants play and the perspectives that they can bring to an organisation. From your perspective, can you explain what underpins the purpose of management consulting?
Look, the main thing with consulting is why do clients bring in outsiders to help, right? And it's because they're facing particular opportunities or challenges where they need either some sort of extra ideas, extra horsepower, or different way of approaching those problems. And so therefore, in a period of lots of change and lots of uncertainty and lots of problems and opportunities that in some ways are kind of once in a career for some executives, being a firm and being a set of people who are able to bring the experience of having done that multiple times and face those sorts of issues actually has real value.
Yeah, for sure. And so 2 ex-McKinsey consultants have written a book, Charles Conn and Rob McLean, Bulletproof Problem Solving, which I think is a great book, and I really enjoyed and got a lot out of reading that book. Did you always find the complex problem solving element of consulting to come naturally, or did you have to leverage processes and different frameworks and things to kind of train yourself?
Yeah, actually, Rob McLean was the office manager of Australia and New Zealand when I joined in '96.
There you go.
Retired that year. Look, I actually don't. I'm not a believer in this idea that sort of great problem solvers are sort of born.
Yeah.
I think it's problem solving. We refer to it as a craft. So it's learnt through practice. It's taught through apprenticeship. So I very much kind of learned it, and I practiced it hard. I loved it. I loved thinking of different ways to approach problems. So I think it's something that's much more of a set of skills that people can learn if they're willing to roll their sleeves up and do that.
I know this is probably a separate podcast, but what are the ways that, young people who are wanting to get into consulting, what are the ways that they can refine their complex problem solving skills that you sort of mentioned there?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is what we do is when we try and hire someone, who's got, great smarts, but also the ability to translate those smarts into problems that they haven't necessarily encountered before, which is why we do these sort of case interviews where you're not really meant to know anything about it. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, the best way to practice is not to over practice, because we actually find often our analyst applicants do better than some of our MBA applicants in the case studies, because the MBA students are trying to find, well, which framework did I learn in what class, and how can I really quickly sort of apply that? Whereas the undergrads, tend to sort of come at it a bit more first principles. So part of it is just learning how to take complex problems and, well, how would I break them up? How would I disaggregate them into kind of more solvable pieces? And so, the advice I give people is read the paper, take a political problem, take a sports problem, take a business problem, as it might be, and say, well, how would you really describe what that problem is? And if you had to kind of break it up into 5 or 6 pieces that you could then sort of wrestle to the ground, what would those be, and how might you then advance that?
Yeah, that's great insight. So Angus, for young people who are going to be finishing up university and want to find out the ways to get an edge in consulting. What do you see as the values beyond complex problem solving that are the most important to being a consultant?
Yeah, the thing we're looking for when we interview, which is trying to find people who are going to sort of most thrive in our profession, our firm, is within the problem solving. It's the ability to kind of really have a discomfort with, not have a discomfort with being wrong, and not, you sort of go through university and you want to do well on exams, you want to get the right mark, and you want to. Actually, what we look for when we interview people is the thought process and the ability to duck and weave around and go, oh, let me try something different, or that doesn't sound right, or hang on, I said that, and now can I just go back and sort of revisit? So there's this idea that when you're solving complex problems, you've got to be able to iterate, you've got to be able to try new approaches, you've got to show that you're sort of enjoying the process rather than necessarily trying to, did I get it right? Did I get an A, or did I get a distinction in that? The other really important part of it is, when we work as consultants, we work in teams. And I have this little sort of test that I run when I do interviews, which is, did I feel like I wanted to help the person or not that I'm interviewing?
Yeah.
Because it's a pretty good proxy for success. Because the only reason I'm at McKinsey all these years later is lots of people helped me many times. And so, the people who work really well in teams, and we have confidence that they're going to embrace the culture of helping each other and seeking out help. And then there's got to be a sort of level of aspiration and drive of wanting to sort of push through barriers and make a real difference. Mm-hmm. It's like, just push through sort of, good enough, or have an ambition to sort of challenge and continuously either make us better or make our clients better.
And so, Angus, you touched on a couple of times there the case interviews that McKinsey does. Can you remember your case interviews that you did when you were applying to the firm, and what was the experience like?
So, you know what, I think I can pretty much remember all of my case interviews.
Yep.
26 years ago, as I was going through the process. The funniest one was my very first one, which was not actually with McKinsey, it was with another firm. And, you get this sort of question, which is a market sizing question. It's a classic kind of first question you get to try and see if you can just apply some common sense and come up with some quantitative estimate. A bit of common sense, bit of primary school maths required to do it. And it's always this thing of, well, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't expect you to know the answer. And I just been through a very detailed analysis of a law case, or in competition law case, which was on the takeover that Arnott's Biscuits tried to do of the US subsidiary of Nabisco back in the 90s. And as it turns out, the company that my father had worked for was Arnott's Biscuits. So I knew that industry. And the interviewer said, okay, I want you to size the Australian biscuit market. And I thought for a moment I was on hidden camera or something. And I said to him, are you serious? And he said, yeah. And he said, don't worry, you're not expect to know the answer. And I said, I can't remember what the exact number was, but I said, well, it's $760 million.
Yeah, without even flinching.
And he said, what? So we had a bit of a laugh about it, and I said, "Look, I've analysed this market every which way, for doing this law case, and so I can tell you by state, by channel, however you like." So he said, "Well, if you didn't know, how would you have worked it out?" So I can remember them. What I really remember actually is that through the interviews, I actually had no idea if I was doing well or not. Where I got offers and didn't get offers and stuff, to me was a complete random walk in terms of how I thought I'd gone. But I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the case studies, and I really liked the people I met at McKinsey. And, all the folks at other firms had sort of told me that, the McKinsey people I was going to meet were all going to be up themselves. But I actually had a completely different experience. And so when it came down to making a choice, I kind of just went with, I was definitely attracted to the brand, and, one person I'd spoken to said, it would be a very brave call to turn down a McKinsey offer, but I was willing to do it because I didn't want to do that for a brand or anything. And then someone just said to me, just pick the people you want to spend your time working with. Mm-hmm. And that was in the end where I sort of ended up choosing McKinsey.
That makes sense. And so your first couple of years at McKinsey, Angus, you did a few years and then jetted off overseas to do your study. But what were the biggest learning experiences that you took out of those first couple of years at the firm?
Yeah, I think there's probably, I mean, there's heaps, but let me see if I can boil it down to sort of to three, right? Which is the first thing I really learned how to structure and communicate my thinking. And I remember the first time I sort of had to write something at McKinsey. I was a good writer. I was sort of, history essays, English essays, 5 years of law, and I wrote this sort of memo that I'd been asked to write, and my project manager, engagement managers as we call them, kind of sat down and he said to me, look, I want to give you a bit of feedback on the thing you wrote. And I sort of was ready for him to say it was just one of the greatest things I've ever seen. And he said it needs a fair bit of rework. And I looked at him, I honestly thought he was joking, because to me it was just, it's a great writer, what could this, and he pulls it out and it's a sea of red.
Oh no.
And I still remember my kind of heart dropping and the sort of heat going up my face. And I realized actually the learning was I'd spent so long writing to impress, with sort of university and sort of, every essay had to have a paradoxically or ironically or sort of some complex clause in it or something. And actually what I needed to relearn how to do was to write, to communicate just as clearly as possible, to make it as simple and clear as possible, which, then of course you have to sort of fend off all the jargon that comes in business and in management and stuff. But that was a really big first lesson of how do I just structure and organize and communicate in a way that's just very straightforward and simple and clear rather than to impress. The second big learning was to learn how to get help, actually. You sort of come into these environments and you think, well, I've got to prove myself and I've got to show I know what I'm doing. And actually, in an environment like McKinsey, we call it apprenticeship for a reason, right? An apprentice electrician or apprentice plumber shows up on day one. They don't know what they're doing. That's why they're not allowed to sort of rewire the circuit board on day one, but they get help. And so actually people succeed in McKinsey because they're just really good at getting help. And that was for me of like, do I really sort of call this sort of partner in Stockholm to ask about this industry and teach me this industry? But sure enough, I was meant to do that. So I pick up the phone, I call this partner. I still remember the call, and I'm a business analyst in Sydney. I hope you don't mind me bothering you. Oh, of course. Yeah. How can I help you? And so I still take those calls from folks around the world now, kind of remembering that and sort of pay it forward sort of concept of that. So the second was definitely learning how to get help. And the third was learning how to learn from mistakes. Because again, apprenticeship culture, you make lots of mistakes. I made a particularly embarrassing one where, I sort of presented a valuation model of a iconic Australian company to Rob McLean, actually, at the time, their managing partner, and realised I'd completely forgotten to include any capital spend. And so they were going to have all this growth without having to build a single plant. And he very kindly pointed out that maybe I should rerun it with some capex in there, and it may lead to them not being sort of, having a real valuation at 3 times their current market cap. And it just, I learned how to make mistakes and actually to be okay with it. And, I don't think that was something that I was particularly good at. And, a bit of that sort of learned humility on the way through.
And so after you cut your teeth at the firm and had all these learning experiences, you actually jetted off to Stanford University to do your Masters of Management, Science and Engineering. Can you tell me about this experience, Angus, and the value that you got from studying abroad and doing a postgrad?
Yeah, sure. So, look, this was a bit of an unusual thing to go do. The sort of standard thing to go and do as a sort of business analyst at McKinsey was to go off and do an MBA. And I decided actually I didn't want to do an MBA because I wanted to actually go learn some stuff that was new and different. And so I found this degree at Stanford that was really designed for engineers to do a sort of final year, 1-year masters. And for me, it was I did over 2 years because I had no science or engineering fundamentals. I kind of managed to get through on my sort of high school maths and a bit of maths in sort of economics. But I hadn't done science since I was sort of 14 and 15 or whatever I was in year 10. So, but I did it because I could then sort of take the course book and choose a whole bunch of interesting subjects. And the subjects I mostly chose were engineering and computer science type subjects to learn. So it was a great adventure. I just got married. We sort of had 2 years of sort of newlyweds in San Francisco together. It was the last year of the dot-com boom in 1999 and 2000, the first year of the bust. So fascinating time to be there. Early days of Google, where Google was the search engine that the Stanford computer science students used. And the main thing I got out of it, frankly, was just a massive broadening of perspective. And I got that both because it was a different country. It was this amazing part of the world in Silicon Valley and the West Coast. But it was also by throwing myself into this field that was completely different. And the first sort of group work that I had to do for a strategy course on technology-based businesses, one of my sort of teammates said to me, he said, "Oh, look, can you explain the table in the back of this case study?" I said, "Well, which table?" He said, "Oh, table one." Table one was a profit and loss statement.
Perfect.
And I said, "Yeah, I can explain table one to you, accounting major and, 3 years as a McKinsey business analyst." And the company we were looking at was Cisco, and I said to him, "What's your background?" He goes, "Well, I'm a double major in computer science, electrical engineering." I'm like, "All right, I'll teach you how to read a profit and loss and a balance sheet and a cash flow, and you teach me how a router works." And we had this great sort of exchange of ideas and stuff to a level of sort of real detail. So it was, it was a fantastic experience. And I know sometimes people think, well, do I want to go and do further study, or do I want to just keep on trucking and sort of zoom through my career? I look back on those couple of years as just a very, very special time.
And when you came back to the firm, did you approach sort of problem solving in a different manner after you'd experienced that, master's education?
Yeah, I did actually. I think there were sort of a couple of ways that I approached it differently. One was, sort of a way of solving problems with a sort of law training is very much a kind of, you break them down into sort of what are all the issues, and you look for kind of what are the facts, or the, in legal sense, what are the sort of cases or legislation that might go with it. And that's very much the standard McKinsey problem solving approach, actually, that came across many years ago from a more legal approach. Economics was very much around the interrelationship of variables, and computer science to me was a completely different way of thinking about things, because it was always this abstraction away from a complex problem and being able to effectively design either an algorithm or design a program to be able to simulate it. And so much more around both decomposing it or structuring it, but then also really thinking about all the feedback loops. And so I became a much better sort of systems thinker from having done it. And I think having those sort of three different muscles of problem solving actually really helped. And the second thing for me was just having gone deep into these sort of technical topics about which I knew really nothing. I remember sitting I took a freshman physics class at Stanford. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. And I was sitting there in like my mid-20s with these sort of 17-year-old sort of people who'd done kind of accelerated physics in high school, sitting there going, this is so straightforward, and literally my head was exploding. I'd sort of go home to my wife each day and say, I think I now know how planes stay in the air. It's kind of cool, So I lost the sort of the being intimidated by technical things.
I think I saw you in another publication saying that you had tried to operate on a robot or something, and you were calling your wife every day going, "I've got no idea how to work this thing."
It was one of my first computer science assignments, and you had to make this little robot dance. I was learning to program in C, which is sort of a bit of an old style programming language now, and you had to kind of create this recursive algorithm in order to make the robot dance. And I was just struggling with it. And she's saying, "You're going to make it home for dinner?" And I'm like, "I don't think so. I can't make my robot dance." To which she had great delight in saying, "Maybe you're just not quite as smart as you thought you were." I'm like, maybe. But yeah, it was it was great from the sense of now I'm willing to kind of pick up the technical books and read them. And I did a lot of work in telecom when I came back, actually, and including helping the government on the whole kind of implementation of the NBN. And I was okay to sort of pick up the books on optical networking and understand kind of the difference in wavelengths and all the different technologies that were being considered and how that was going to work. And I would have been too intimidated to have done that before having gone and sort of jumped in the deep end.
So, Angus, you've been at McKinsey since the very start of your career, 25 years, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of change both inside and outside of the firm. Can you tell me some of the insights that you've got into the biggest shifts that you've observed internally and externally since joining the firm?
Yeah, thanks, Finn. It's a really interesting question. I'll start in a slightly different place, which is what hasn't changed. And to me, kind of, when I sort of reflect back on almost 100 years for McKinsey of our history, what hasn't changed is this mission of making a real difference for our clients and being a place where we call it sort of exceptional people want to stay to thrive, right? And then our values, which is kind of do the right thing and put our clients' interests ahead of our own in order to really sort of build trust and enduring relationships over time. But what has changed is context. Right? So what are those kind of most important issues or opportunities or challenges that our clients need help with? 25 years ago, it was much more around dealing with globalization. Now it's much more dealing with technology and disruption, right? And whether that's a strategic question where sort of the fundamentals of an industry are really being shaken free, or whether or not it's thinking about their own sort of choices they need to make in terms of their own capabilities, whether it's rethinking the whole way the organization operates to be much more like a sort of startups at scale, or agile at scale, as well as then kind of other huge shifts and trends that are happening with, for example, the sort of net zero transition probably being the biggest disruption that we're going to face over the next 30 years, with a lot to happen in the next 5 to 10. For Australia, by the way, it's a huge opportunity as well. Huge opportunity. And you can see sort of some of the sort of announcements starting to come out around hydrogen and things like that. So that context means that we are, I think, increasingly doing some of the more profound strategy work that in some ways was sort of the classic McKinsey work kind of 20, 30 years ago. But also, we're doing a lot more work with clients as what we would call being the impact partner, not just the insight partner, right? Mm-hmm. Where actually the advice of what to do is only useful to the extent you can actually help execute it. And so for McKinsey, we have a lot more deeper, longer term relationships now with our clients to really sort of help them make some of these transitions.
Now, Angus, some or most, I should say, consultants that I speak to can recall their favourite projects with ease. What are your favourite types of work to be on, and can you recall some of your favourite projects that you've worked on?
Yeah, look, the thing I've always loved most from a sort of intellectual standpoint in terms of consulting is just sort of getting under the hood of an industry or a company, understanding what really makes it tick. We use in our strategy materials, we always sort of put up this picture of Roger Federer, and we say, well, why does Roger Federer make so much money? Let's just use a really sort of crass sort of version of it, and people kind of start talking about why he does, and then we I think it's probably a pretty bad copyright violation, but we take Federer's head and we pop it on a badminton player, and we go, okay, now how well does Federer do now? And everyone's like, oh, well, you probably won't do as well because badminton's not as popular, and it's like these sorts of questions of, well, why does a particular company outperform another company, or why does an industry outperform another industry, and getting down to the real sort of details of it. And I find pretty much any industry and any company just an intriguing puzzle to sort of try and solve.
Angus, I think it's really easy to get sort of sucked into the long preserved narrative that McKinsey does the boring and corporate work. What would you say in response to that, and what kind of opportunities exist within the firm that most people wouldn't expect?
Yeah, of course you can't let me sort of let that question slide, really, can you? Because I actually don't think we do any boring work.
Well, it sounds like
One
it.
of the fantastic things we get to do is actually that our clients only bring us in on their most interesting challenges. And so, yeah, in a way, the kind of very decision to engage someone like McKinsey is already filtered out anything that might be boring. If it's boring, it probably means they don't need us to do it, and we won't take on the work. So, the sort of issues that I think big Australian companies are dealing with at the moment are fascinating. Like they're really, really interesting, and they are, many of them are sort of new problems that these executives haven't addressed before, and some of them are even new to world problems. Like, for example, how do you, if you're an Australian bank, get the right glide path for agriculture? No one solved it around the world, but Australia has to, because agriculture is such an important part of our net zero transition. We do also sort of do a whole bunch of stuff that people wouldn't necessarily associate with McKinsey. So one of the examples was the work we did with Emirates Team New Zealand, which is the America's Cup team, where it's amazing when you look at sort of the history of these boats, and you're too young to remember, but there was this great moment in like 1983 when Australia won the America's Cup, and there was this mysterious winged keel that was like this breakthrough design from a guy called Ben Lexon. Anyway, 30 years later, it's still this, or almost 40 years later, in fact, it's very much a technology race. And the whole issue for boats is who can actually iterate their design fastest. And so we created this effective kind of digital twin, which was a way of simulating the boat design. And we did this alongside the Emirates Team New Zealand folks, who were sort of brilliant engineers and brilliant designers. And we had this sort of moment where our kind of reinforcement learning engine actually, came up with something that that the sailors hadn't. And these are all ex-Olympians, Olympic sailors. So we kind of referred to it a bit as the AlphaGo moment for our simulator. I think it kind of made a real difference. And so that sort of work is, again, a sort of new to world complexity of a problem. And we have this term that we use, which is we should do work that frankly only McKinsey can do.
Mm-hmm.
Which has both a humility to it and also a bit of can have a bit of an arrogance to it, but we try and sort of get the balance right, which is, let's not do things that we're not uniquely able to do, but also let's do things in a way where we think that only McKinsey can really bring together that sort of cross-section of talent and capabilities to be able to get something like that to happen.
For sure. And so, Angus, going back to your story specifically, I know you are very passionate about your work in philanthropy. You're a supporter of Champions of Change initiative and a director at the Katrina Dawson Foundation. Can you tell me about what these initiatives mean to you?
Yeah, sure. So the Champions of Change initiative is around kind of increasing gender diversity in leadership. It was started a bit over a decade ago by Liz Broderick, who was the Sex Discrimination Commissioner back then. And it was originally actually called the Male Champions of Change, which was quite controversial at the time, right? Because it was, there were all these sort of male CEOs who effectively said, we want to do more and we want to sort of step up alongside women who've been sort of battling for sort of gender equality for a long time. One of those founding CEOs was one of my clients, and he called me after a few meetings and he said, well, the first meeting we all tried to sort of pretend that we knew what we were doing and sort of share our sort of progress. By the second meeting, that started to unfold, and by the third meeting, we realised we really don't have the answers and we need some help. So I came in as effectively the advisor to them. And frankly, for McKinsey, we've always struggled with this issue of how do we keep fantastic women in McKinsey. So I went in also with I could bring up problem solving, but I certainly was willing to admit right at the start that I needed the ideas as much as anyone in terms of what we wanted to do with McKinsey. So it's been a remarkable forum, actually, because what it did was it created a space where leaders could be really open about the things that they were wrestling with in order to drive change. And there were some simple things, like it started with not agreeing to speak on any panels if it wasn't a gender diverse panel, which now seems so obvious, but a decade ago it was a sort of bit of a new thing. And then there were more radical experiments around flex work and sort of how to actually approach domestic violence as a workplace issue and so on. But look, there's a long way to go. The Champions of Change is now, I think it's up to over 200 sort of CEOs across sport, government, industry. But we're still so far behind in terms of where we need to be on gender representation. And then that's before we even get into sort of ethnic, LGBTQ diversity, Indigenous, et cetera, But ultimately, we've got to get to a place in society and workplaces where, wherever you come from and whatever your profile, you feel like you can be yourself and you can thrive.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the Katrina Dawson Foundation?
Yeah, so Katrina was my sister. It's obviously much more personal. She was killed in the Martin Place siege in December 2014. And after that had happened, and we were obviously all in kind of massive shock and grief. But one of my friends, and he was also a client, suggested that we start a foundation in her memory. And a bit of it was motivated by Martin Place at the time in Sydney was sort of blanketed with these flowers that had sort of come out to sort of remember Katrina, remember Tory Johnson, who was also killed in the siege. And he sort of said, you should, it's going to feel weird at the moment, but you should start something. And he made a very, very generous initial donation. And since then, we've sort of turned it into a real foundation where we support, girls who otherwise wouldn't be able to get to women's college at Sydney University, as well as through the Aurora Foundation, we help Indigenous girls explore kind of offshore study opportunities, and also high school girls through the Smith family. So, it's been a way of taking something awful and turning it into something, turning to service in a way of creating something kind of special and honouring in her memory.
Absolutely, and that I'm sure that honour will live on, and congratulations on such an amazing initiative, Angus. I was also going to ask you, in 2019, you were promoted to your position of managing partner for, Australia and New Zealand. Can you take me into your mind when you found out about the promotion, Angus? It had to be a pretty amazing reward for effort.
Yeah, thanks, Vin. I mean, look, it's a incredible honour and responsibility. I was in Amsterdam when I found out. We were at a global meeting, and the global managing partner was there as well, and he asked me could I come to have a chat to him, and I knew he was either going to tell me that he wanted me to do the role or he didn't. And I remember sort of sitting in my room afterwards and just sort of reflecting on the sort of huge trust that was being placed in me in the role. I mean, it's a different kind of role than I think a lot of people expect. It is a managing partner role, and therefore it's very much leading from amongst the partner group. And different of our partners have different big roles in McKinsey globally, and these roles aren't sort of more important or more senior than the other. But it's very much then my responsibility to sort of convene us in Australia and make sure that we're kind of heading in the right direction. And I had a very clear sense of some of the things that I wanted us to do a bit differently, to make sure we stayed as relevant as possible for our clients, and to make sure that we were sort of as attractive as possible for great talent.
Now, Angus, to wrap up, I know you mentioned a little bit earlier a couple of times that you had some pretty steep learning curves when you were first joining the firm. I'm a massive proponent of the concept of either a win or a learn. It's not a win or a loss. And I've been harping on about this in my previous episodes because I think it's a great philosophy to have. What do you see as the biggest win that you've had in your time at McKinsey, and probably more broadly as well?
Yeah, so first of all, I love that approach of a win and a learn. I'm actually going to take that with my son, who can beat himself up a bit when he doesn't do as well as he wants. But so look, as an advisor and as a consultant, my wins are really the kind of wins of my clients and colleagues. And so probably the biggest win has been, one of my clients got a big role in a very, very tough context, and has really thrived over the last few years in that role. And as a result has had an incredible impact on his organisation, and it's an organisation that really matters for the country. And so, you can sort of see the impact that that's had on the country. And it's something that, I played a small part in. and I feel great to have been able to do that. On the learn, look, there are lots early on. I'll probably share one that's more recent actually. That was, in sort of the early days of the pandemic, so sort of mid-March last year, where I'd been in the role for about a year, and I sort of again I had clear ideas of what I wanted us to do and some of the shifts I wanted us to make, but the pandemic was not anything any of us had experienced. And, I remember we were sitting in this partner meeting, and it was literally, I think it was like March 13th or something. It was literally the day that everything went into lockdown. And this meeting was in New Zealand. Literally that night that we flew out, but the borders closed that night. We'd had a case scare in our office, so we had to move all of our interviewing to being remote. And we were talking about what we should do, and we were sort of going around, and sort of each person was sharing some of their views. And one of my colleagues, who's quite efficient, at some point said, "We're way over our agenda for this particular item. Can we sort of adjourn this and sort of get on to the next item?" And I turned to him and I said, "Hey, look, you can go out and do other stuff if you want to, but I need to hear from everyone because I genuinely don't know what to do." And for me, who I think I'd always sort of prided myself on being able to know the answer and have a strong point of view as to what to do, in that moment, and it wasn't that I was sort of creating space, in a tactical way. I really had no idea what to do. We didn't know if all consulting work would stop. We didn't know if people would get sick. We didn't know whether or not we'd be able to keep people employed. We just didn't have any idea what was going to happen. And the big learning for me was in that moment of me just being really open, that I had no idea what we were going to do. First of all, I got brilliant advice from everyone. We actually worked out a plan. And then over the next 6 months, the whole way I led sort of evolved, which was much more about working through others and creating space, which I'd already started to do, but I think it was just the real sort of boot that I needed in order to really sort of embrace that way of doing things. And so, even at aged, whatever I was at the time, 46 or whatever, and a year into being managing partner, I was probably on my steepest learning curve ever, which is part of what I love about what I do.
Absolutely. Never know what's going to be around the corner. I suppose that's
Exactly.
the essence of consulting, isn't it?
It is, and it's also, I think the idea that, you sort of keep learning steeper and steeper as you get older, and in many ways, many of the experiences that I had, whether or not they were at university or whether they were in my early days as a consultant, it's sort of learning how to learn, and often that starts off learning how to learn more technical things or ideas or whatever, and then as you get a bit older, it's sort of learning how to learn about yourself and your own sort of leadership and your own sort of strengths and weaknesses, and how to kind of manage through those, us being all sort of very imperfect beings trying to make a difference.
For sure. Angus Dawson, thank you so much for taking the time this morning. I know how busy you are, so I'll let you get back to it, but I really appreciate your time, really appreciate the insight and you being so candid about your journey so far.
Thanks very much, Finn, and it's been a great pleasure to talk to you.